Hi everybody, I hope you've managed to enjoy a nice Easter break with your family indoors this bank holiday weekend, and that you're not feeling too overwhelmed or apprehensive about starting our remote learning journey together as we move into a new unit. Now today we're going to start the first of a fortnight session on a new unit, which is legislation, statutory guidance and policies and procedures. Now this is a combined unit. What we've essentially done is take any criteria relating to legislation, policy, procedures or guidance from all the other units across your whole course and pull them all together in a combined unit. Now, this is a good way of doing it because it means that you don't find yourself being really repetitive in the remaining assignments that you're going to be covering, but it is a very intense unit. So in light of the fact that we are remote learning, okay, and we're not going to be doing any class-based delivery face-to-face, and our lesson's going to look a little bit like this for the time being, we've decided that rather than give you the display or information pack assignment method, which is what we usually do, we ask you to go away and create a display in your school or go and create a wonderful, colourful information pack for potential new teaching assistants. We are literally going to ask you to copy and paste the criteria that's listed on the assignment brief on Moodle and pop that into a Word document or a format of your choice. So maybe you prefer PowerPoint presentations, that's fine, or Pages, whatever it is that you're familiar with using and comfortable. Copy and paste the criteria and just go through and answer it as you go. Okay, because that's just the easiest, most straightforward way of doing it. You will have to reference still when you're doing that, particularly in this unit because we're talking about legislation so heavily. You're going to have to reference that legislation or those policies and procedures or that statutory guidance. Now there are some of you who really enjoy writing an essay and you like to write one long flowing document of work. Now that's absolutely fine, you are welcome to do that, okay? We just wanted to provide you with the option of copy and pasting the criteria into a Word document or otherwise and just going through and answering each one, almost like a question workbook style, which I'm sure you'll sit to the back teeth of after completing the safeguarding workbooks, and well done to you all for doing that. Okay, so this week we are going to be covering the criteria in this unit, which is essentially about policies and procedures, okay? And a little bit later on tonight, I'm going to start up a conversation between you all as an ongoing task around the impact that the coronavirus is having on those policies and procedures. And we can share some ideas and maybe some best practice from what we know about our schools and our settings. The criteria we're going to cover today is 5.1, 5.2, 4.1 and 4.2. Now in the PowerPoint we have all the criteria listed there, but really for this week we're just going to be going through those slides with that criteria, and we'll pick up the rest around legislation and health and safety implications next week. Okay, now I'm hoping that you can see this and we haven't got the light shining on us. I'm also hoping that my toddler remains in a nap during this period and my 7-year-old is quite happy playing on Lego World for a moment. So apologies if we get any disruptions. Okay, so first of all, we're just going to clarify what we mean by these terms so everybody's clear. What we mean by legislation, what we mean by statutory guidance, what we mean by policy, and what we mean by procedure. Now, some of us are going to be more familiar with these terms than the others, but it's important that we know in education how they all relate to one another and how legislation and acts of law transcend into our everyday working practices. So, legislation essentially means laws. Okay, so these are made by our government and they are agreed in Parliament. So when we talk about legislation, I want you to think about us talking about law, essentially. Okay, we know really if we're looking at a piece of legislation, if it usually includes the word act in it. Okay, so we're thinking about acts of Parliament there that have gone through. Okay, laws need to be enforced and they need to be followed, and it can be a criminal act to break one of these laws. Okay, so they are there to really uphold everything that we do within society. But if we're thinking about education and we're thinking about legislation and laws that have a direct impact on our working practices, we can think about things like the Children's Act or the Equality Act. Those things that have changed how it is for us to go to work and the experience that children are having right now in schools. Okay. Statutory guidance. To read a law, a piece of legislation, is quite a difficult thing to do. Very thick documents, very wordy, and if we aren't familiar with the legal terminology that's being thrown about, because I'm certainly not, it can be really difficult to make head or tail of what is trying to be put into place here. So we very handily have statutory guidance that sits alongside or just underneath. Okay, so if it's statutory, we've still got to do it, but the guidance basically puts it into layman's terms, or sort of what those laws and what that legislation actually means. Okay, so for example, we've got keeping children safe in education. That's some statutory guidance which underpins legislation and law, or the law and the legislation underpins that statutory guidance, but it breaks it down for us. It explains to us what it means and how it impacts on our day-to-day working practices. Okay, legislation, statutory guidance doesn't have the word act in it, which means in themselves they are not legislation and they are not law, but they absolutely are written about that legislation or about those laws. Okay, it's really important that you find the most up-to-date legislation and the most up-to-date statutory guidance. Okay, so when we have statutory guidance in education, for example, it's being updated all the time. For example, working together to safeguard children in education, the latest one was 2019, but if you were to Google working together to safeguard children in education, you may find ones that go back as far as 2014, or it may be that schools are still citing the historic statutory guidance within their policies and procedures. And it's a job in itself to keep yourself up to speed. So just make sure that when you're referencing for this unit and when you're doing your reading and research, that you are finding the most up-to-date statutory guidance. Okay. Policies. Now, most of the time, policies are down to the individual school to create. Sometimes the local authority, sometimes the multi-academy trust. But basically, policies are made from the legislation and the law, from the statutory guidance that follows and explains that legislation and law, and the individual and specific needs or implications or barriers of that school are translated into the policies and procedures. Okay, so for example, if we're thinking about the Children's Act, if we're thinking about keeping children safe in education as our statutory guidance, we then can think about the safeguarding policy of that school. Now, in some situations, it may be that the local authority implement their own safeguarding policy that the schools within that locality adopt, and that makes sense. But best practice now is for each individual setting, provision, school to have their own individual and specific safeguarding policy that relates to the needs and the dynamics of their school or educational setting. And that also safeguarding policies, as well as any other, reflects historic events. So for example, it may be that we've got a school that was involved in a serious safeguarding issue or whistleblowing issue with a member of staff, that their safeguarding policy or their whistleblowing policy should reflect the actions that they took on the back of that. So maybe they put in a new procedure whereby we couldn't have homework clubs that happened after school with one teacher, let's say. Maybe on the back of something that happened in terms of whistleblowing, they put 2 teachers in for safeguarding purposes, and that their policy now, very individually, is going to reflect that working practice based on safeguarding events that happened in their school. So policies do need to reflect the individual needs of the school, the dynamics of the cohorts of children that they serve, the complexities of the community that the schools are located in, and also historic events that have happened within that school, lessons learned, let's say. okay, and experiences that the schools have had. Okay, policies are vast. Each school, each setting will have many policies. It's unrealistic to expect any member of staff to know policies off the top of their head. Most schools have a policy manual printed that you can flick through and you can observe, and most have the majority of their policies online as public documents for parents and carers and other professionals and visitors to view. Okay.